Weeks after temperatures in southern Spain hit more than 40 degrees Celsius, the UK is experiencing its third heatwave of the summer. What does climate change and increasing temperatures in many places mean for all of us? We will discuss that on this latest episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio, and shortly we're going to talk about some of the stuff that was in the communique from the UK-French summit in London this week that went a little bit unnoticed, but it's very important because it's all about defence, and there's some stuff in there about nuclear weapons. So the ultimate defence. So we will talk about that. Now, something, if you're in the UK, particularly in the south of the UK, that will not have escaped your notice is that it's very hot. We are experiencing a heat wave. Another heat wave, because there have already been two of them in the UK this summer. And actually lots of places in Europe are experiencing extremely hot weather. For example, a couple of weeks ago in southern Spain, it was well beyond 40 degrees Celsius. So let's talk about what is actually going on with the weather, how that links to our climate, because it is separate, and also some of just the implications for how we live in this world of increasing global temperatures. So we've got two people who can do that brilliantly for us. Joining me here in the Newscast studio is Jordan Dunbar, who is one of the hosts of the Climate Question podcast, which is also made in this very office. Hello, Jordan.
How are you doing?
Very well, thank you. And also here is Sarah Keith-Lucas, lead weather presenter for the BBC. Hello, Sarah.
Hello. Hi, Adam.
Would you like to plug your documentary that we're talking about?
Oh, indeed. Yes. So I have made a documentary recently called Heatwaves, the New Normal. And it's all about sort of discovering how higher temperatures are affecting so many different parts of our life. So I visit a heat lab to look at how high temperatures influence how your body reacts in exercise conditions. Talk about wildfires. So I interview some firefighters that are at the kind of sharp end of kind of wildfires and climate change, and also talk about our everyday lives, so our commute, our buildings that we live in, things like that. So how a lot of things in our lives are affected by higher temperatures, and you can find that on iPlayer.
Perfect viewing for this weekend. Jordan, let's do the GCSE geography bit now about the difference between weather and climate and why it's dangerous to conflate the two, but at the same time they are linked.
Sarah, you probably have your own version of this, but the one that I always turn to is, if you think about weather as what's happening now, or looking at the last 24 hours, 36 hours, looking at what's going to happen. Whereas with climate, you're taking the weather data from years, if not decades. So you're using the weather to build a trend. And that's what the climate is looking at, have we got wetter in the last century? Have we got warmer? And then you can also use that information to try and make a forecast of what could be happening in the future.
And so it's difficult to say the heat wave we're experiencing right now is because of climate change, but you can say climate change makes heat waves like this more likely.
More likely, yeah. So
in this part of the world.
The Met Office have said that particularly in the southeast of England, it's going to be drier and hotter over summers. I think where people get caught up is we say, well, southeast going to be drier and hotter during summers, and then one year it's really rainy. And they're like, well, look, it's really raining.
Where's your climate change now?
But that's not a trend. That's your one-off. And that's the difference, is looking at those long-term changes.
Sarah, I just used the term heat wave to describe what we're living through today. Was I correct there?
Yes, you are, Adam. Absolutely. Yes. So heatwave, the technical definition from the Met Office is 3 consecutive days above the heatwave threshold temperature. Now that varies across the UK, so across parts of Scotland and actually much of Northern Ireland, Wales and England too. The heatwave threshold is 25 degrees, but that gets progressively higher down towards the south and east. In London region, it's 28 Celsius. So 3 days above that heatwave threshold. And we're certainly seeing that at the moment. And some places could see up to about 6 days or so above that temperature.
And 3 is a trend because this is the third heat wave of recent weeks and months.
Yeah, that's right. 3 within the space of just a month, and coming quite early in the summer as well. Usually June is our coolest month of the summer, but in June this year, we already saw 2 significant heat waves. And this one into the start of July is just even more widespread and intense, affecting more and more people.
And how are we doing with like attributing the causes of individual spells of hot weather? Because I know there are some of them you can link to atmospheric or oceanographic phenomenon on the other side of the world sometimes.
Yeah, well, the science has moved on a lot, I think, in recent years. So when we were talking about climate change, sort of even about 10 years ago, we'd often say we can't attribute one specific event to climate change, but the trends are there. But nowadays, actually, we can be much more specific than that. So there's scientists at the World Weather Attribution, and they specifically model the climate that we have now with human-induced climate change and compare it to the pre-industrial era. And they can actually say how much more likely individual events have been made. So, for instance, the sort of temperatures that we've got at the moment in this heat wave, they're about 5 times more likely down to human-induced climate change.
And Jordan, Sarah mentioned at the start of our conversation when she was very she was in plugging mode, which I'm happy with. We like to promote each other's work. About some of the areas she'd been looking at that are affected by hot weather, like forest fires and things like that. What are some of the areas you've been looking at in the climate question?
Well, our latest episode, which is coming out this weekend, is all about holidays and climate change and how it's going to change where we go on holiday, what we do when we go on holiday, and the places where people like to go on holiday. So my colleague Greg Jackson's been speaking to experts all across the world about places affected, about the tourism industry, and looking at what things like extreme heat and wildfires, but as well as floods and sea level rise, what that means for all the places that we love to go on holiday around the world.
And what does it mean?
Well, I think
I'm sure it means multiple things in multiple places, but
if we stick with heat and what Sarah was just talking about, for instance, wildfires, we saw in much loved places like Spain and Portugal, and then last year around southern Europe, really, really bad wildfires, shutting down airports. So you can't have a tourism industry if people can't get there, and then people can't get out. Also threatening hotels. And the more that happens, there becomes a mindset change, which is like, if you're in southeast England, say, and it's 30 degrees regularly, we normally want to escape to get some heat. But if you're going through constant heat waves, do you really want to go somewhere that now is regularly hitting 40 degrees? So what they're seeing in peak season is less demand. But off season, they're seeing more people coming to try and escape the heat in places like the Mediterranean.
And then to bring it right back to home, and actually people's homes, you've been looking at our building stock.
Yeah, one of our episodes, we looked at how we build around the world, and it was about heat. It was actually inspired by my apartment. The apartment I live in is unbelievably hot all the time. It's like a copy-paste new build that could be in Hong Kong or Dubai or Shanghai. Yeah,
I'm sure you made it your own now.
I've tried. But the one thing I haven't been able to do is keep it cool, because the way we design these buildings, you think about a skyscraper in the desert in Dubai, glass and steel, you need massive amounts of aircon. Now in the UK, very few places actually have aircon, but we're using the same designs. And so we were looking at somewhere in Egypt and Cairo where they used to build wind towers, and that's catching the natural breeze. So it's like a very low energy, low carbon, traditional way of cooling your home.
And Sarah, I know you've been looking at houses as well. Sorry, I sound like you're going house hunting, but I know you're looking at the concept of houses in hot weather.
Yeah, absolutely. I think more and more of us have noticed, and with our houses, our homes are getting hotter. Certainly I have. We've got 2 climates in my house, quite cool downstairs, but really, really hot upstairs. And I think a lot of people are finding that as the heat rises in buildings, particularly higher up upstairs, getting really, really hot. But we've been looking at all sorts of things, at how people have been trying to adapt, particularly in terms of architecture. So some new homes now are built with, for example, different materials, sort of using terracotta tiles and things that were more traditionally used in a Mediterranean climate to try and reflect that heat away and keep things cool. And also shading of the windows as well, because shade is such an easy way to keep us cool if we can use it in the right way. So in places like the south of France, where all the windows are shuttered, for instance, we're starting to use more and more of those kind of designs, and sort of sills above the window as well to bring more shade. So it's really interesting to see kind of fairly simple but effective ways that people are starting to change the way we think about building new homes.
And Sarah, that's homes. Let's talk about workplaces now. And one of the great things about Broadcasting House is that I never complain about the temperature here. It always feels like it's just right. And on a hot day like this, it's nice and cool. But are there issues with other workplaces where it's not as comfortable?
Yeah, it's a really tricky one, because legally there's no limit actually to upper temperature. So there's no saying that over 28 degrees is too hot to work. It's never, legally is it too hot to work in the workplace. There is a legal limit for being too cold, or a guidance anyway. There's a guidance figure that it's meant to be over, I think it's 14 Celsius, so below 14 Celsius not ideal for working, but there's no upper limit. And the reason for that really is that because of the nature of workplaces. If you're a chef, you're probably very used to, high temperatures in the kitchen. Firefighters obviously work in really, really high temperatures. So because of the necessity of certain roles to work in high temperature, there is no limit. But I think increasingly that companies are starting to kind of wake up to the fact that productivity certainly goes down when people are very, very hot. So schools as well is another big one. People really need to be kind of clear-headed and focus, not just the students, but the teachers as well. So we're seeing a lot more change in behaviour. So in schools, for instance, they're relaxing the dress code. Children are in their PE kit, for instance, instead of their full school uniform. But it comes back to those buildings. It's really difficult to adapt and redesign a lot of our school buildings and workplaces that were built hundreds of years ago.
And Sarah, tell me about the helicopter.
Oh, yeah, that was fun. I now want to travel everywhere by helicopter, please. I loved it. But so particularly up in Scotland, that's where I went to do this filming with a helicopter. They often fight wildfires by helicopter in hard to reach remote places where you can't physically get a fire engine to those places. So they're run by private companies because there's no kind of nationally owned firefighting helicopters, but they're so effective because they can literally within minutes take off, fly over a lock, drop a huge bucket, scoop up a massive amount of water, and drop that water right on top of the wildfire. So hugely effective way. We've seen it with what's been happening in LA and places like that, fighting fires from above, massively effective compared to just fighting them from the ground. So I joined them for a training exercise, just watching the pilots just scooping up the water, flying by, and within about 3 or 4 minutes, they can drop 1,000 litres of water every 3 or 4 minutes. So it's amazing to see how effective it is. But of course, very expensive way to fight fires.
And Jordan, it'll be interesting to see if the climate change we're experiencing means that actually the state needs to step in and spend more on fighting forest fires, and maybe we have a publicly funded like helicopter firefighting operation rather than these private companies that Sarah's just been hanging out with.
Yeah, I think it really is about a mindset change around the world and in the UK for both when we're looking at, the idea of firefighting and housing and even holidays is that what we think of the weather in the UK, it's a cold place, it's a rainy place. That's why we've built our houses like this. That's why we go places. But more and more is becoming hotter and dangerously hotter. And I don't think we've quite got that into the national psyche that when you're building houses or when you're planning big events in certain places around the country during the summer, that actually we do have very, very hot weather and it is becoming more common.
And Sarah, what's your take on this? As somebody who's worked at the BBC doing weather forecasts for a few years now, how do you approach whether it being a hot, sunny day is a good thing or not? Because in the olden days of the like old classic weather forecast, it'd always be like, great news, it's going to be really hot and sunny today. Crack open the ice creams. But it's not like that anymore.
No, it's not. And it's really tricky because actually it's still really nice to be the bearer of good weather news. So it's nice to tell people that they can have the ice creams at the weekend and, it's going to be nice. And people generally, improves our mindset when we like to see a bit of sunshine and warmth. So there's that aspect of it. But of course, everybody's tolerance for heat is really, really different. And looking at the context of climate change and how we're seeing more and more extreme heat, it's no longer becoming a simple good news story when we see good weather. We've had hosepipe bans come in. This is going to affect a lot of people. Farmers often, really desperate for some rainfall. So I think we've had to kind of change our terminology and the way we talk about heat and good weather, try and be very neutral, stick to the facts, and also put the weather into the climate context. Is this normal? Should it be this hot? And more we are talking about climate change and how unusual weather is instead of just kind of reporting it as a nice day.
Well, thanks for doing that for us today, Sarah. I understand you're now rushing off to the school sports day, and I cannot imagine how many questions you're going to get from mums and dads about how hot it is, how long it's going to be this hot for, how people should keep cool, because I imagine that's just your whole life these days.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, I think things like sports days, for instance, people are having to change how these things are run and when they run it. So schools, I know, have been talking about perhaps doing it in a different term, not the traditional summer sports day that we're all used to seeing.
Winter Sports Day.
Yeah.
Which I actually would prefer. Sarah, thank you so much and have fun at Sports Day.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks, Jordan.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
And Jordan, I'm just thinking to your very hot flats, do you have a particular way of keeping it cool that does work? You're saying it's a bit of a struggle.
I've sort of given up, so I just fill the bath with cold water and throughout the day get in it. Like
really?
A very small swimming pool for a little bit and then
okay.
I get out. And that lowers my core body temperature enough to sort it out. But I live in perpetual darkness. Just
because the curtains are closed, the blinds are closed.
You have to keep the curtains closed and there's not enough breeze.
Yeah. I always remember a few years ago someone telling me, probably actually a BBC weather presenter, that the mega trick is a frozen bottle of water from the freezer with a fan behind it.
Oh, yeah.
And you combine the two, and it's basically making your own little homemade aircon. But I'm worried about the use of the electricity for the fan, for the freezer, the sustainability of the plastic bottle. Also, it does melt overnight, and so you end up with a sort of slightly soggy bottle in the corner of the room. And also the noise from the fan. Anyway, we could do a whole podcast about that. Jordan, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, as promised, let's dig into some of the lesser noticed bits of the agreement between the UK and France this week. There was loads and loads of fanfare about this one in, one out migrant deal to deal with the cross-channel crossings. And there's been lots of commentary and questions being asked about that. And we are still awaiting further details about how it's going to work. But there was lots of other stuff in the communique that Macron and Starmer issued yesterday, particularly around defence, and also about the UK and France's nuclear deterrence, which have always been quite kind of separate nuclear weapons programs, but look like they're inching closer together, which to me seems like something quite significant that maybe we should dig into. So let's dig into it now with somebody who will have been reading that communique and reading between the lines. It's Shashank Joshi, who is the defence editor of The Economist and who's back on Newscast now. Hello, Shashank.
Thank you very much for having me.
Right. There was loads of stuff in the news coverage yesterday of the Anglo-French summit about migration, less so about defence, of which there was actually quite a lot in their joint statement. What things jumped out for you?
Well, above all, I think the language on nuclear weapons was the really interesting bit. There already was a bit of French-UK nuclear cooperation going back to the Lancaster House Treaty of 2010. It's quite a big deal in the field of defence. But what's happened is that language has been sharpened up. There is promise of a new, effectively a council to think about cooperation, not just on policy, but also on operations, nuclear operations, which I suppose could include things like synchronizing the patrols of nuclear-armed submarines. And there's also language around the circumstances in which both sides may use nuclear weapons. And then I think the other big thing here is the suggestion of a new headquarters for this coalition of the willing for Ukraine that will be in Paris. And that's the other big step in this statement and in these talks.
So on the nuclear stuff, is that almost like the French and the British joining up their nuclear deterrence? So it's more like one nuclear deterrent rather than two?
I wouldn't go that far, but I think it's narrowing the gaps between them. It says our nuclear forces are independent, but they can be coordinated. And I think the thing you have to remember here is, which is very, very significant, the French are fiercely independent about their nukes. So they have never ever taken part in joint NATO nuclear planning. There's something called the Nuclear Planning Group, the NPG, and the French have never been part of that. So for them to talk about coordination of nuclear forces with the Brits, that is something very novel and very new. And I think the idea is to say to the Russians, even if the Americans don't respond with nuclear weapons in a crisis, there is now a greater risk that the French and the British do so in a joined-up fashion, which imposes more dilemmas on you sitting in Moscow.
But I suppose Starmer and Macron don't want to do anything that looks like escalation because they always criticise other nuclear powers, particularly Russia, when they even sort of mention the word nuclear.
Yeah, I don't think they want to be nuclear saber-rattling in the manner of some Russian officials. But I think the argument is to say, let's be more joined up. So, for instance, back in 2009, I think it was, we had the remarkable case of a French and British nuclear-powered submarine, not a nuclear-armed submarine, colliding in the Atlantic on patrol, which I think in one way shows you
the
how
odds
stealthy
of that are out of this world.
Well, it shows you how stealthy they are, but also shows you that there isn't any synchronization. The argument is, if you're, say, putting a nuclear-armed submarine in and out of port when it's most vulnerable, for example, could you talk to the French and make sure that we are not bringing our submarines in or out of port at the same time as a new boat is being sent out, that we're staggering those patrols? I think that's one example of the kind of coordination you may expect to see.
And what about this idea that some people have talked about of a kind of bigger nuclear umbrella for the whole of Europe provided by France and the UK, so that, for example, Germany doesn't feel the need to go and get its own nuclear weapons?
I don't think we're at the point of any kind of shared umbrella. I think we are at the point of each country saying the scope that is covered by our nuclear weapons is a bit bigger than you think. The Brits have always said, we have always said, our nuclear weapons are devoted to NATO as a whole. In fact, we extended those guarantees to Sweden and Finland before they formally joined NATO. The French have never said that. The French have always said our vital interests have a European dimension, but they've never said what that European dimension is. The language that's really interesting and new here is, as the UK puts it, they say, any adversary threatening the vital interests of Britain or France could be confronted by the strength of the nuclear forces of both countries. And that kind of language is beginning to sort of say, actually, there isn't a formal nuclear Anglo-French umbrella, but we are hinting about something in that direction.
Oh, so in the unlikely event of an attack on the UK that became nuclear in some kind of way, this would sort of bind France in as if almost like a sort of mini NATO Article 5 for the two countries.
Well, I think actually what it's doing is to say that we, Britain, have always committed our nuclear forces to the rest of Europe. But what the French are now saying is we're kind of moving towards that British language, that British scope of coverage. And I think that's very reassuring to lots of the other countries in Europe who would like a bit more French protection. By the way, not least because the French have certain nuclear capabilities, that is nuclear air-launched nuclear weapons that can be used without having to expose your submarine, that the Brits don't. And that's a very helpful thing for other European allies.
And the government is giving itself quite a lot of plaudits for all the deals they've done with the French this week. Is this a diplomatic victory for Keir Starmer? And I suppose it's difficult to disentangle Starmer's actions and his ability as a statesman from just the fact that this government is more friendly towards European partners because they're not hung up on Brexit.
Absolutely. And we saw that in the gushing comments made by George Osborne saying we were restoring sanity to the relationship. So yeah,
because George Osborne was there this week in his role as chair of the British Museum, which is going to host the Bayeux Tapestry.
Exactly. And as you say, you can't disentangle the policy around, fisheries from small boats and defence. They're all part of the same broad rapprochement with Europe. But nonetheless, I think for Starmer to have built up this very mature relationship with Macron, not just, culminating in London just now, but built up, I think, over several months where they've been working together on military planning for a potential deployment to Ukraine. I think that shows real patience, maturity, careful thinking. And of course, for Starmer, who's really, I think, on the back foot domestically on economics, on the fiscal situation, it's obviously a welcome bit of respite for him as well.
And what did we learn about this new coalition of the willing and what they're prepared to do to support Ukraine if there is a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia?
I think it's all fairly limited still. What people may not have known, just to take a step back, is that there is this thing called the Combined Joint Expeditionary Force, CJEF. And it's been around for a long, long time, more than a decade. But, you wouldn't have heard of it. Most people wouldn't have heard of it. But it is a kind of joint UK-France headquarters or planning setup where at the very high level, officers can get together and plan military missions. What's really interesting about the announcements we've just seen is that that CJEF, that Joint Expeditionary Force, is being built out its role is being deepened and it's being connected to the planning for Ukraine. So they're saying that force will provide the joint planning framework for any coalition that eventually goes to Ukraine. But having said that, I think at the same time, the original vision for this deployment in Ukraine of a large peacekeeping force in the country, that has narrowed a little bit. It's a much more modest force at this point that is not about deterring Russia with combat-capable forces that would surge to the front lines. It's much more of a small reassurance force that, as much as being a ground force, would have an air and naval component. And if it ever happens, if there is ever a ceasefire in Ukraine, I think that this puts in place the kind of muscles to make that happen.
And Ukraine related, we got some comments from Donald Trump overnight about that he's going to make a major statement on Russia quite soon. Always hard to interpret what Donald Trump actually means, especially before he's said it. What's your take on what's going on there?
Well, look, Ukraine policy in the White House has been going up and down, but I think we're in a place where it is stabilizing. There are some early signs it is stabilizing, and those early signs are not just Trump's evident public impatience with Putin, saying he's stringing me along, he says one thing, he does another. He's used some pretty rough language and coarse language about Putin. But I think more fundamentally, the aid has been turned back on. That's very, very significant. We had a brief suspension of military supplies, particularly air defense interceptors. Those are going back in. And more importantly, Trump is using regulatory or kind of procedural methods that he hasn't used so far to authorize and send aid to Ukraine. And I think all of that, to me, suggests he is finally, or he may be finally, getting it, that he is not going to get his prized deal with Putin unless he shows a little bit of steel and a willingness to apply pressure to the Russians. I think we may be moving in that direction.
And final question, considering what we've been discussing this week is UK-French relations, have you seen the Bayeux Tapestry?
I have not seen it, but I did notice the fascinating difference in language, with the French saying it would be leaving the country for the first time, and I think the British government saying it will be returning to Britain. So those historical battles are, they may be centuries old, but they're still lingering just under the surface, aren't they?
Yes, well, I'll see you in the queue at the British Museum next year.
Absolutely.
And two updates before we go. One of them, inevitably, is on Newscast, because I've just remembered this time last week, when I was actually very busy doing something else, I got a message from Jonathan Isaby, well-known political commentator, writer, and at one point, communications director for Liz Truss. And he messaged me with some of his political mugs. He's got a Vote Leave one, but he's also got one that is marking the birth of the Lib Dem Tory coalition in 2010. And it's a picture of David Cameron and Nick Clegg in a love heart, designed basically like one of those commemorative plates you'd get for a royal wedding. And it's something to behold. So thanks to Jonathan for sending me those this time last week. And also apologies to him for taking me so long to thank him for those messages. And then the other update is actually more of a reminder, which is that we're doing our Edinburgh Fringe shows, which I'm really excited about, because as a Scottish person who loves the arts and theatre, the Fringe is just such an exciting place to be in the summer. And that's where Newscast is going to be for a week, Monday to Friday, the 4th to the 8th of August. We'll be doing shows every day at a venue called the Gilded Balloon at the Museum. Don't go to the original Gilded Balloon. This is one of the offshoots of the Gilded Balloon at the National Museum of Scotland. And you can get tickets, which are free, if you click on the link, which is in the episode description of this very episode of Newscast, which has now come gracefully to a conclusion. I hope you can get comfortable in hot weather over the weekend, and we'll be back again very soon. Bye-bye.